welcome. You're watching India Development Debate. I'm Tamanna. Inamdar. State budgets get very little national coverage, but in the last few days, we've had a slew of states announce their annual budgets with a focus on high spends at a time when debt consolidation is a big challenge. Our focus tends to be on the union budget, where the macros are closely dissected, but perhaps equally crucial is how states spend their revenues. The states of Punjab, Maharashtra, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh have put out their budgets, and there is a clear theme. In fact, Punjab's budget has been announced just today. High spend, populist budgets, no real focus on debt reduction. Punjab and Rajasthan are reverting to the old pension schemes. Maharashtra's debt has gone up 6.8 lakh crores, and UP has announced a budget of 6.9 lakh crores, which is the largest in its history. So are these budgets actually improving the lot of their citizens or drowning them in future debt? To speak on this, I'm joined now by M Govinda Rao, former member of the 14th Finance Commission, Mitali Nikore, founder and economist at Nikore Associates, joining me on the show, as is Garima Kapoor, chief economist at Elara Capital. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for speaking with us. Garima Kapoor, let me begin, with your take on, and I want an overview really to start off with, why it's important to look at what states are doing with their budgets and what they're promising. Because that goes under the radar, and a lot of these states are going into elections either next year or the year after that, and the budgets seem to be very clearly focused on such populist measures.
I think the states in the larger context of things are very critical, because nearly from consolidated point of view, states are about 60% of consolidated spending of India. So if you take center and states together, we tend to give excessive focus on center's budget because it's a single data point, a single document. But when it comes to states, it's tedious exercise to analyze 28 state budgets, but clearly they tend to be more important in scheme of things, especially when it comes to the ground level schemes, especially related to housing, transport, or irrigation, where center does not really take a significant focus. And also because states in recent years have actually expanded their balance sheets significantly, especially after the global financial crisis, and more so during COVID. And I think analyzing state budgets will give us two perspectives. One is that, is the center in sync with states, or are the states in sync with the center's objective when it comes to growth and focus on capex? And second thing is that, are the states sustainable in terms of the way they are budgeting their finances? And that's where I think looking at states deeply becomes very crucial for us.
Absolutely. And in that context, we're seeing what states are doing. And remember, over here, we're not pinpointing at any one state. This is a larger theme that we're looking at. So the idea is not, to say one state is politically doing better than the other. At the end of the day, all state governments want to keep staying in power. And that's a common theme. So M Govinda Rao, let me come to you on how big a concern it is that state governments start consolidating their debt, especially now, when over the last few years their revenue sources, or the control they have on their revenue sources, has dipped. After GST, they have to depend on taxes coming from real estate, petroleum products, and alcohol.
As was mentioned by the previous speaker, almost 2/3 of the expenditure incurred is at the state level. And they raise somewhere about 37-38% of the revenues overall. But at the same time, we should know that macroeconomic stabilization is predominantly, not exclusively, predominantly a central function, whereas allocation is predominantly a state function. And that is one of the reasons why the total borrowing of the states is actually controlled at the central level. The Article 293 says in the Constitution that if a state is indebted to the center, it should take the permission of the center to borrow. Which means, given that the FRBM limit is given at 3.5%, that means that the center should allow them to borrow. However, there are some states which basically do a lot of off-budget borrowing, and this is particularly a problem with the power sector. That's one part of it. The second part, and therefore, stabilization or sustainability at the aggregate level may not be a major issue as far as the states are concerned, but individual states can, sort of get into a lot more of trouble because of the off-budget borrowing and various other, hidden sort of indebtedness. But at the same time, capital expenditure is important. That would mean that what is your revenue deficit or revenue surplus? There are states which have, you said 6.9 lakh crore in the case of Uttar Pradesh. Uttar Pradesh is projected a revenue surplus, and that is basically means that the entire borrowing money will be used for capital expenditure. Whereas in the case of Punjab or Rajasthan, Punjab is a very serious case. We may say that the individual states don't matter. They do. In fact, there was a committee under Monte Ahluwalia when the pandemic struck, and then I was asked to, I was a member of that committee, and I was asked to look at their finances. And actually, the subsidy to the power sector, even at that time, was almost 2.5-3% of GSDP, which means that the entire borrowed money goes into that. So, and then now, in this particular thing, I think it's almost 26,000 crores, which basically means that they will not be able to do, sort of a capital expenditure. That is a concern for the state. Mind you, Punjab had the highest per capita income 12 years ago, and today its number is 7th or 8th. So, and then they have been doing it. In fact, I have been working on Punjab finances for the last something like 35 years.
Just to understand, Mr. Govinda Rao, from the budget today, they have pegged their fiscal deficit at 4.98%. They would say that this is slightly better than what the union government's fiscal deficit is.
No, that is not true. Each state has a sort of FRBM target.
Yes.
And according to FRBM target, it has to be it can't exceed 3.3% this year.
Right.
Which basically this is only a budget estimate. When they during the course of the year, when they don't get the borrowing money, they will have to prune down. They will have to bring it down. Aggregate states fiscal deficit is, in fact, last year it was they were allowed 3% plus 0.5% extra for power sector reform. And aggregate, if you will see, the revised estimate would say that in the aggregate they would be just about 3%. Similarly, in the case of Punjab, there may be some exceptional cases where this thing the center may allow, but center has to allow them to borrow. They can't really, if they don't have the funds, how do they finance the deficit?
Absolutely.
Financing of the deficit has to come through borrowing when they have such a large revenue deficit. So they may budget it at 4.9% as a matter of, and then they will possibly complain saying that the center is not allowing us to borrow as we go along. But basically, the FRBM limit is that the states cannot borrow more than 3% of GSDP.
Absolutely. Mitali Nikore, great to have you on the show. I just want your perspective of, and we have literally just picked the states that have put out their budgets in the last few days, Punjab today, Maharashtra yesterday, and then of course before that Rajasthan and Uttar Pradesh. What are the, commonalities that you see in terms of measures that will get these governments re-elected? Remember, these state budgets are also a way to get these governments more votes, these parties that are in power more votes, so that they come back.
Thanks a lot for having me on the show, and a very interesting discussion. I think at the outset, it's important to mention that when we look at the RBI's latest state of state report, it's a very important report that RBI comes out with every year based on the data, submitted by the state governments and its own calibrations. The gross fiscal deficit consolidated of all states average comes to about 4.1% in 2020, then drops to 3.7% in 2021, and is projected to drop further to 3.4% in 2022. So this is actually a very welcome development overall, because it's showing that, as when we look at a general direction, all of the states are moving towards a little bit of the consolidation of the gross fiscal deficit. So I think that's the first, important takeaway. Now, the second takeaway, of course, you mentioned some states, but it's a general point about electability and about what states are really spending on. See, there are two things that states have to spend on. The first is the implementation of centrally sponsored schemes, which they often supplement with their own, welfare schemes. So, say for example, if there's a centrally sponsored schemes around prevention of domestic violence, the state may come up with its own complementary scheme and use the finances to amplify the impact of a centrally sponsored scheme. Now, this is one way, and this helps because you are getting some funds from the center already in order to meet some welfare objectives. And the second is to have its own scheme, completely new, which is rarer. And most of the states which have their own completely new scheme in the social protection space are typically doing direct cash transfer schemes, particularly to women, because it has been observed that direct cash transfer to women actually helps both in terms of electability but
True.
also in terms of
So just
some
a
of the
quick
welfare
follow up, Mitali, and taking off from what you're saying, like there is good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. There is good spending and there is bad spending, and I'm really simplifying it here. I'm talking to three economists, but I'm simplifying it here for our viewers as well. And that's there with state schemes as well. So if you're giving bicycles to girl students so that they can be mobile and actually go out and get an education feeling safer, that's perhaps a good spend. Free power beyond a certain point, not so good spend. Do you think
Absolutely.
do you think that you're seeing more bad spends than good spends in recent state budgets? Mitali, that follow-up for you.
No, I don't think so. I think that there is a realization, as I was saying, based on the data of the RBI report, it's very clear that there is a rationalization, there's an understanding amongst most states that you have to rationalize, you have to move towards good spends, you have to look at impact assessment reports, you have to look at what's working at the central level, tie up with central schemes, and try to amplify them. I think there is a movement towards good spends by and large.
Garima, Kapoor, would you agree with that, considering at least 5 states are reverting to the old pension plan and they are going to have to at some point finance that, right?
I think one of the most, I think, negative developments over the last few months has been the pronouncement by few states to go to old pension scheme. Now, what that does is it creates a fiscal space currently, but eventually, in matter of few years, you will suddenly have a huge liability to basically service, and you would not have adequate space in your budget to be able to do that. And because they have now reverted some of the states like Rajasthan to old pension scheme, it partly explains why Rajasthan capital outlay growth in FY23 BE is 30% compared to the previous year's 20%, or FY23 RE is 20%. This immediate space is positive for capex or positive for certain schemes, and also gives them space for certain revenue expenditure, which could be populist. But I think it is going to be one big problem that is going to come to haunt us. The other thing I think, which is not so much in the debate, and which partly one of my co-speakers mentioned, is off-balance sheet budgeting. Now, some of the southern states of India actually had a very I should say, practice that was pulled down by the government of India, where they were actually parking a part of the resources under, which were part of the revenue of alcohol proceeds, etc., taxes were being parked under a different special purpose vehicle, and the borrowing in the market or against in the banking system was done against these proceeds. Naturally, it was not getting accounted for in the fiscal deficit of the existing of those state governments, but it was actually a contingent liability which was not reflecting. So, of course, central government came down heavily upon this. So such practices also have been or have recently probably become pretty rampant. Of course, central government has cracked down upon that. But what that really means is that those states who created the space by putting some proceeds out of balance sheet, and which they didn't have to show in the part of the fiscal deficit, will actually now have to show it in the fiscal deficit. And that partly explains why some of those states have actually struggled to spend, okay, at a desired run rate in the current financial year. But having said that, while the focus of the discussion has been in terms of relatively negative points in terms of debt liability, old pension scheme, I must point this out. A high frequency data of state budgets, we look at 12 state budgets very closely on monthly basis where the data comes in. April, January, so far this financial year, the combined fiscal deficits of the states is less than 50% of budgeted estimates. This financial year, states have literally struggled to spend and spend on capex particularly. So while the center is making the right noises and is enhancing its allocation and
Maji,
execution on capex, it's
Garima
the
Kapoor,
states
why
which
is
have been
that?
laggard.
Why is that? Why are they struggling to spend?
There are two reasons. I can point to three reasons. One, the reason which I told you, off balance sheet, budgeting that took place that actually put some lid on capex on some states or spending ability of some southern states. Second is basically when generally it is observed in India's case, history shows that every crisis year, states tend to consolidate or pull back significantly larger. So when we started off this financial year, you were not very sure whether there's going to be another wave of COVID or no. So states were a little skeptical. So states started off their spending on a relatively weaker note. And by the time it realized that there was no really overhang of COVID, that there was no really threat, more than half of the year had already passed away. And remember, the execution capabilities of states to spend on roads, irrigation, on agriculture, housing is much, much weaker than that of center. And the third reason what happened is that just as center saw a significant bonanza in revenue, especially GST, carpet, and as well as income taxes, the center was basically, passing on or devoluting to states a larger chunk of the revenue. So states were actually seeing a bonanza of revenue, whereas the spending continued to be on what they had budgeted in the budgeted estimates when they started off this year. That partly explains why a fiscal deficit is trailing at less than 50%. So I doubt whether they will even reach a 3%. The good part of all of this is you will actually create a space for capex next year. So I am not very, very pessimistic in terms of the current development, because I think that current year's disability or inability to spend on capex and the excess surplus the states have created because of extra revenue would enable them to be able to spend in the forthcoming year, even if certain undue expenses crop up or the revenue targets get
Okay,
missed.
big picture here, Mr. Govinda Rao, and I saw you smiling there while Garima Kapoor was talking about how states have barely been able to spend what they're supposed to on capex. Why do you think that is, and what is the big takeaway for our viewers in terms of what you should look out for and expect from your state governments?
Now, let me put, give 2 or 3 points. One is there are some developments in the state at the state level which are not very fortunate. Whether it is a loan waiver, whether it is a additional food subsidy, whether it is an old pension plan, or whether it is free electricity, all these have other consequences apart from the fiscal cost. And much of it comes from the borrowed funds. I mean, let us understand that. And as far as their ability to spend is concerned, it's in fact each of the state government actually has ambitious capital expenditure put in. In fact, their budget estimates are much too high, and obviously they want to do it. In fact, you see, even if they, saying that they will have 4.5% GSDP, they will do it, but then they can't get that money during the course of the year. Because, see, in 2020, their limit was 5% of GSDP. They spent they ended up 4.1. Last year it was almost 4%. And then again, they spent less than that. So the basic thing is, there is a long, ambitious planning for capital expenditure. And they are not able to really, execute it because they don't get the amount of money that they plan. That's the second. This is particularly so in the last 2 years. In fact, 2021, 22, and 22, 23, partly because of the lockdown and various other problems you had. And here again, there are some states which have been doing extremely prudently. Very surprisingly, you will see Orissa, year after year, they were having a revenue surplus. And then the entire borrowed money they are able to spend. It is not that they don't have a capacity to spend, they have the capacity to spend. This year, they are going to have a little more problem because the centrally sponsored schemes for which the money has to go, central government has increased, the increase in centrally sponsored schemes is expenditure is just about 1.5%. Now, which means in real terms, this is as a percentage of GDP, GDP.
Right. So state spends
now,
increase. I'll have to wrap it
they
here,
have
sir.
to continue the programs. They have to continue the program. So we are going to have trouble.
Okay.
There is not serious problem as far as the capital, as far as the state finances are concerned, but there is certainly a concern about off-budget borrowing, which the government of India will have to come and
I think at the end of the day, the real question, because we tend to get caught up in the numbers, we tend to get caught up in the economics of it. The real question is, are states making the best use of their revenues to improve the lives of the people who live in those states? Are they spending on the right things? And that's really,
there are some states which do it.
yes.
I'm
out of time, sir, unfortunately. So these are my closing comments. There are some states who do it. There are some states perhaps who don't. But as citizens and voters, these are the questions really that we should be asking when we look at those state budgets. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us on the show today. We'll take a very short break, but we'll be back with a lot more. Stay tuned.